All roads leading to Austin. Hope is a dance with the impossible. Jacob. The heat of the late summer was far worse here in the Midwest. He was used to a drier heat, and the humidity in the air just sucked the energy out of a man. His men were lagging behind, their steps slowed by exhaustion. Jacob wiped away the sweat beading on his forehead and eyed the approaching storm. It was humid, and the clouds were gray and ominous. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and occasionally he could see the twist of light strobe through the thick, roiling layers. It was a bitch of a storm headed their way. It would cool them off. It already was, now that the wind had picked up, pushing his damp hair away from his forehead. He needed a haircut. Hell, he needed to stop walking and fighting and watching what was left of his unit die for no damn good reason. This town, Clinton, was a destroyed shell. Most of the buildings were either partially collapsed, burned, or mere skeletons, reaching fire-blackened brick chimneys to the sky. After weeks of fighting in June between the Western Front and the Allied South, most of the inhabitants were either dead or had fled. His orders were to clear the east side of town, confirm that the Western Front had moved on out of the area, and reconnoiter with Bravo unit before nightfall. Jacob just wanted to sit down and sleep, but sleep brought nightmares. Dreams of a blonde-haired boy, mushroom clouds, and radiation warnings. His men were spread out dog-tired and stretched to their limits, thanks to the endless muggy heat and meager rations. Scouts hadn't found any food locally either. The shelves of stores had been stripped bare for nearly a year now, and it was every man, or soldier, for himself. He had heard talk that most of the men in Tango unit had melted away in the night, disappearing like cockroaches under cover of darkness, likely heading for home or whatever was left of it. He wondered if it was time to do the same. Could JJ and Nancy still be alive? He knew how unlikely it was, but still, his heart wanted to hope against hope that they were both still out there. Divorced or not, he loved her still. No one else had come close to giving him the feeling he had when he was with her. Nancy hadn't wanted to be a military wife. She'd wanted more. She'd wanted to finish her master's in art history, and who was he to hold her back? When the end had come, she had already moved to Austin and served him papers. He'd managed to come and visit and see them as often as he could on leave. But it wasn't enough for little JJ. He would cry and beg him not to leave at the end of the visit. They had been too close to ground zero, likely still asleep on that sunny Saturday morning when the nuke blew a crater into the northeast section of the city and annihilated anything within a 12-block radius of the Arts District and the University of Texas. That's where Nancy was a student, just a year left until she earned the degree she had fought so hard for. He wanted to believe it had been quick, that his boy hadn't suffered, and that he hadn't died screaming like the scores of others who were farther away from the detonation site. It still gave him nightmares. The carnage that they had shown on the enormous view screens in the Fort Hood Commons before the blackouts took out the internet had haunted him ever since. His scheduled leave had been that morning. He had stood there, bag in hand, planning on hitching a ride with friends after missing the train out the night before when the news hit. All roads leading to Austin have been closed until further notice. Authorized medical and emergency response personnel only are allowed in. The bag had dropped from his numb hands, the ground rushing up to meet his knees, the air leaving his lungs, hollowed out, empty. His family was gone. Leave had been canceled, all troops recalled. Not all the men had returned. He knew of plenty who had family in Austin, and had likely been there at the wrong time. Good men that he would never see again. What am I doing here anyway? How does this solve anything? We fight each other. And for what? He knew the company line, had parroted it back to the senior officers, shouted, "Yes, sir," and told his men to keep going. But as the days had turned into weeks, and weeks into months, it had all seemed so pointless. Communications were down, and their orders, when they received orders at all, were often conflicting. The reality was, they weren't fighting an outside enemy. They were fighting themselves. And those were battles that no one could win. Nancy. Nancy woke from the dream, a scream dying on her lips as she sat up in the pre-dawn darkness. Uncle Ray stared at her, from his well-worn seat in the kitchen. "You all right?" "Bad dream." Jacob, alone in a wash of radioactive hell, bleeding, burned. The vision of it hung there, painted in her mind, the taste of ash in her mouth. She should have called him. But she hadn't, and now he was gone, lost in the blast of the radiation that followed. All it would have taken was a phone call. The father of her child, one of the best men she had ever known, gone. Uncle Ray coughed. It sounded wet, thick. He always sounded worse in the morning, eventually given a shot of strong black coffee to loosen it up, and he'd cough up a mass or two, thick yellow globs shot through with blood. On a bad day, it would be mostly blood. He should be in a hospital, but since the blackouts and the shortages and the very bad day, the hospital was no longer a place you went to get better. The very bad day had struck more than 2 months ago, and Nancy had given thanks to God every day after for where they had been and where they had not been when the nuke struck Austin. Over 1 million dead, probably twice that. The fate they would have suffered, at least for her and JJ, that close to ground zero, it would have been quick, but still. She had seen what it had been like for those who weren't as close. Burns that wouldn't heal, hair that slipped from scabbed heads and clumps, blowing on the floors of Davis Medical Center like listless fur balls, impossible to keep up with. She did her best, though, when not changing bedpans or scrubbing the sheets clean by hand now that the power was out. She pushed a broom and tried to round up the errant hairs. It seemed to her that those strands of hairs had deserted their posts, leaving behind hollow-eyed, bald skeletons that did not seem to notice their absence. For that matter, they appeared to see nothing, eyes staring and lost, their radiation-sick bodies wasting away before Nancy's eyes. There were dozens of them, specters that had driven, walked, even been carried from highways and byways leading from Austin. They had spread out like a sickness, meandering through the country like broken homing pigeons, one foot in front of the other. JJ mumbled in his sleep and turned over, curling up against the table leg. His hair was slick with sweat, his cheeks red from the heat. Nancy could see it was early still, the sun, a weak specter sliding up into the sky, barely pushing its way through the thick cloud cover. It was hot, stifling in the small, single-wide mobile home, and she sat up slowly, her back aching from the rough bed on the floor. "I made coffee." Uncle Ray coughed again, turning away, grabbing for the handkerchief he kept in his shirt pocket. His bony frame shook, convulsed, and Nancy winced at the rattling sound that accompanied each of his breaths, in and out, in and out. He bent over, let the cough take him, and gave himself to it, almost retching. He spit into the handkerchief. "Christ!" "You watch your tongue, Raymond Withers," Aunt June said, tottering out of the bedroom at the far end of the narrow trailer. Her face was a pasty shade of gray, and she said it half-heartedly, as if it took too much out of her to say more. "We give thanks to God, not use his name for curses." She looked for a moment as if she would fall, gently swayed back and forth, then slowly regained her equilibrium, and shuffled to the easy chair. It occupied the corner opposite of the table that JJ still slept restlessly underneath. "Where's your oxygen, Auntie?" "Out." "What? But we got that last Tuesday. It was supposed to be full." "Well, it weren't. I knew it felt light when you brought it in. I took it easy on it. Just like you said." She paused, caught her breath, and continued, "Ain't nothing to be done about it. I'll manage." Nancy shook her head. "I'll see if I can't get another. Maybe if they pay me less in potatoes for my work, I can ask for an extra can. You need it, Auntie." June reached out her hand and touched her niece's arm. "Don't you dare. That child needs food more than I need it. Silly oxygen. You hear me?" Hard, hot tears pricked at Nancy's eyes. "Yes, ma'am, I hear you." June and Ray had raised her without complaint, after the mother she barely remembered had died of leukemia. She had been 4 years old when the social worker had brought her to the small, one-bedroom trailer, looked it over with a jaded eye, and said, "Kids are made of rubber. Just let her sleep on the floor under the table. She doesn't need a room of her own." She had leaned close, speaking low, but Nancy had heard her all the same. Better with you than with strangers and a ward of the state. You got no idea how bad it can be." And they had just nodded and taken her in. It felt as if Uncle Ray and Aunt June had been sickly in one form or another all of her life, but not this bad, never this bad. They had moved slowly, were in their 60s by the time Nancy had entered their lives. That first fall, when it was time for kindergarten, Nancy had held June's hand and walked with her to Midlands Elementary on the southern edge of Elkins. Everyone else had young moms and dads, but Nancy's had white hair and wrinkles. It was a different way of life, simpler, with no frills, but they had loved her and made sure she grew up healthy, with decent clothes on her back and food in her belly. Sleeping under the table hadn't been that bad, wasn't bad now, and JJ loved it. He had drawn stars on the underside of the battered formica table and called it camping. They had taken her in and never once complained. When Uncle Ray had called 3 months ago and said Auntie was in the hospital, Nancy had dropped everything, picked up JJ from his daycare, and drove straight on through to Elkins, West Virginia. They had only stopped for gas, fast food meals, and what had felt like every damned rest stop along the way, because JJ still couldn't hold it for long. She hadn't even thought to call Jacob until it was far too late. They had just checked Auntie out, driven her home, and settled her in her easy chair when the reports had started coming in. Chaos, screaming and crying from the folks in the park as they watched the mushroom cloud over and over and over again on the television. JJ had snuggled close, despite the muggy heat, and whispered, "It's a very bad day, Mom. It's a very bad day." The entire cell phone array was down within minutes, and it wasn't long after that the rolling blackout started, each one longer than the one before, until finally the power shut off completely. How many times had she tried to call Jacob over the next few weeks? Hundreds? The calls wouldn't go through, and one of the power surges that had accompanied one of the last blackouts had taken out the phone and Uncle Ray's computer, the AC unit, and the television in one go. They were down to a radio that produced nothing but static, and no word from Jacob. None. Nancy sighed, staring at her son on the floor. JJ asked every day, as hopeful as the day before. She hadn't told him that his dad had told her he would be visiting them in Austin, that he had bought the train tickets a month before the nuke and swore he'd be there. She had forgotten all of it in the panic of getting to Auntie's side in the hospital, scared she would lose her. And then, staring in horror at the images on the screen, she had been afraid to tell JJ his father was dead, hoping beyond hope that he would magically appear, walking down the cracked macadam, with his duffel bag in one hand, clothed in the familiar fatigues. The very bad day, Nancy sniffed. JJ's name for it had stuck, and not just with Uncle Ray and Aunt June, but the rest of the scattershot inhabitants of Happy Hollow Trailer Park, which was neither happy nor in a hollow. With the loss of power over a month ago, many of the park's residents had packed up their station wagons or trucks and headed away. "I got a family out west. I'm a-fixin' to see how Canada is right about now. I hear the power is on in New York." And slowly they had scattered, sometimes in the morning, others in the dark of night, but most when the sun was high in the sky. JJ, who was as outgoing and gregarious a child as Nancy had ever seen, saw most of them off, waving goodbye to the frail and weak Longbottoms and their disabled daughter, hollering "Safe travels" to Jolene Nichols, who had made the best angel food cake in the world, and the Larrabees, who were determined to find their youngest son. "Not all the roads leading to Austin can be closed. He's at the university there, studying architecture, and we'll be back once we fetch him," Amber Larrabee had said, her face determined, a small, brave smile on her lips, even as her eyes betrayed the truth of it. Their son had been in campus housing, so close to the epicenter that even his bones weren't dust. A brief millisecond, and hundreds of thousands of sleeping, innocent people had vaporized. They would never find him, and chances being what they were, they would never come back either. Nancy looked down at Aunt June's gray face, which held so many familiar lines and wrinkles. June smiled up at her grandniece. "Be a dear and fetch me a cup of that black tar Raymond's brewed up. That will put some power in me." Nancy fetched her the cup, added 2 sugars, and noted how low the packets were in the bowl. A few more days left if she went without any, but they would run out of coffee before that. Hell, they would run out of everything by tomorrow night. She closed her eyes, her heart stranded in the dream of her ex-husband, terrified she would have to choose between eating and buying more oxygen for June, and wondering if she would be digging 2 graves in the next few months. Jacob. The storm hit fast and strong. It had been threatening it for an hour, perhaps longer, the dark clouds massing, rotating in the brisk breeze, the branches on the trees swaying. There had been a battle here not long ago, and most of the houses were in ruins, burned and broken. The rain was falling, thick drops, and there was little or no cover. If Jacob and his men could make it just a half-mile further to the north, there was a hill with a rocky outcropping they could camp underneath. Lightning flashed, and he heard something coming from a small shed up ahead. The fence that had surrounded it, along with the house that it had undoubtedly belonged to, were both splintered wooden ruins. The house had gaping holes in the roof, one wall blown completely off, and there appeared to be crude graves, complete with tilting, rough crosses. He could no longer see his men. They were spread out too far. The same noise attracted his attention again. It was definitely coming from the shed, and almost lost in the crack of thunder and the rushing of rain. What had he heard? An animal? He walked toward the shed, his fingers sliding into the trigger. He carefully swung the door to the shed open, surprised to see 4 faces gaping up at him in fear and shock. He stood for a moment, taking in the scene before him. There were 2 young children huddled in a corner, and 2 teenage girls frozen in fear at his feet. In the red-haired girl's arms was a tiny, pasty, limp newborn. Another flash of lightning showed he was a boy. The baby had obviously been born mere seconds ago. His umbilical cord was still attached. They all looked at him with undisguised terror. Corporal Jacob Daniel Sr. turned his gun to each in turn. A rifle was propped in the far corner of the shed, but no one moved. He stared at the newborn and remembered the day his son had been born. The nurse had handed JJ to him, wiped clean and wrapped in a soft blanket, and he had stood there in the Army hospital in Fort Hood, stunned at how tiny and fragile the child was. 1,000 images of his little face flickered through the corporal's memories like a home movie. He had grown so quickly from a tiny infant to smiling toddler, and finally into that precocious 4-year-old who slept with a battered G.I. Joe doll that had belonged to Jacob and insisted that he was going to grow up and be just like Daddy. The children at his feet were holding their breath, eyes wide, terrified. They were all children, even the older 2, who couldn't be out of their teens yet. What in the hell was he doing here? As if losing JJ wasn't enough. This war, it was killing them all, ripping apart families and destroying lives. He could hear his men moving closer, calling over the radio for his status. Soon, they would be close enough to see the shed and its occupants. Inexplicably, almost unbelievably, he lowered his gun. His body sagged slightly. He was so tired of fighting, so tired of war. All he wanted was his family back. In a voice that was surprisingly soft, barely audible above the thunder and wind, he said, "I had a son once. It seems so long ago. His name was Jacob." Then, without another word, he turned away, softly shutting the door behind him, and disappeared into the raging storm. Outside, the storm raged on as he called over his radio to his men. "Move north. There's nothing here but the dead." And the troops marched on, with Corporal Jacob Daniel Sr. leading them. He marched through the mud, past a row of bombed-out houses. He barely noticed the crude grave markers or the bodies lying in ditches far north of the small town. Instead, his memories were consumed with the laughter of a blonde-haired little boy who had died far too young. Nancy. "We dig one bigger grave, put 'em both in it," Harvey said, nodding to a shaded spot. "That's good soft dirt there, easy to dig into." Nancy nodded wearily. She had found them, hand in hand, side by side on the bed that morning. The way she figured it, Aunt June had likely gone first. She had been struggling since the last canister of oxygen had run out the week before. When Uncle Ray had realized she was gone, he had gathered her up in his arms and just let go, too. Anyone who tells you that can't happen doesn't know a married couple who has spent more than 60 years day in, day out with each other. Uncle Ray had been devoted to Aunt June. There was no sense in his living if she was gone. The coffee was long gone, had been for weeks, but Uncle Ray would still get up every morning, shuffle into the kitchen, open the cabinet door, and stare at the spot the coffee was supposed to be, as if it would magically reappear. It was as predictable as an alarm clock, and Nancy would wake to the sound of the bedroom door creaking open and usually be sitting up by the time the old man made it to the kitchen. When Uncle Ray didn't wake her up that morning with his usual routine, she knew something was wrong. A quick glance in the bedroom had confirmed it, and she had slipped out of the front door of the trailer quietly, thankful that JJ slept so soundly. She had walked down to Harvey's trailer at the end of row 3 to ask for help. Now in his late 50s, Harvey wasn't any spring chicken, but there wasn't anyone else to ask, and she wasn't sure she could manage it on her own without waking JJ. He didn't need to see that. Her son was a gentle soul. Even if he did keep talking about becoming a soldier like his dad, he had cried inconsolably 3 nights straight when his hamster died, just 2 weeks before they left Austin. The trailer park was empty now. The trailers that were capable of travel had moved on, leaving gaps that felt like missing rotten teeth. The remaining trailers sat uneven and rusting in places. Harvey had suggested they pull the bottom sheet, wrap it around the bodies of Uncle Ray and Aunt June, and slide them on out down the hall. Nancy had covered the open edge of the dining table with a sheet and prayed JJ would continue to sleep soundly. It hadn't been easy, but they had done it, easing the sheet-wrapped bodies down the narrow hall and out of the trailer, down the 3 short steps, and to the cover of the trees. Harvey's breath rattled in his throat. He wheezed and coughed, hacking until he shook it loose from his lungs and spat it into the dirt.
Let me catch my breath, then I'll help you. I got me another shovel in the shed out back of my trailer.
I got it, Harv. You rest. Harvey harumphed.
You ain't got nothing, girl. You're as skinny as a rail these days.
He scratched at the tufts of white hair that still sprouted in odd patterns on his mostly bald pate.
You gotta eat more to keep that energy a-going. I hate to say it like this, but hell, leastways there'll be more to eat now you got 2 less mouths to worry about.
Nancy felt a surge of anger, followed by a wash of sorrow. Harvey was plain-spoken, and she knew he didn't mean anything by it, but damn it, she wished he'd shut his trap. As if she hadn't thought of it herself, and not just today. She dug the shovel into the ground, and it yielded easily, just as Harvey had said.
Previous owners had a goddamn sandbox right around here. They figured they'd have it for their kids to play with. Only thing that got in it were the damn cats. There was more shit in this sandbox than there was sand. But I figured that'd make it easy to dig in, huh?
He smiled at her, his teeth yellow, one of the front ones chipped away at a sharp angle.
Sure does,
she grunted as she dug deep. The sweat was already rolling down her back and onto her forehead, the flying dirt sticking to it. Hot work, dirty work. She hadn't remembered the sandbox until he mentioned it. She tried to play in it a couple of times as a kid and been turned off by a rather fresh cat turd. After that, she'd stuck to the tiny yard that went with the trailer.
Mommy?
She could hear JJ calling in the distance.
Shit. Here. His rough hand closed on hers. You go take care of your boy. I'll keep at it.
He flapped a hand at her as she cast a look at the bodies, the hole, and then back at the trailer in the distance.
Go on with you. I can handle this.
I'll be back soon. She jogged away, trying to formulate the words to say to him. Jacob. He woke up on the hard ground, the sound of fish splashing in a nearby lake. It wasn't quite dawn, and by now they would have noticed he was missing. It was time to move. Put some miles between him and his unit, and more importantly, the superiors, who would do their best to find him and make an example of him. He wouldn't build a fire and heat up one of the MREs. He'd just down a protein bar, some water, and get going. Later, he could chance a fire, but not yet, maybe not even tonight.
It'll have to depend on how far I get.
Jacob felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach, the thought of them hunting him as a deserter. The army was all he had known. They were more family to him than the laundry list of foster homes he had stayed in.
That's what drew Nancy and me together. A wish for family. Both of us missing out growing up, even if she did have her aunt and uncle.
Jacob paused mid-swallow.
That's it. If she and JJ are alive, they'll be in West Virginia. I need to head there, not Texas.
No one would think of looking for him in West Virginia, or on any roads heading north or east. They would expect him to go to Texas, which made sense, but Nancy's family was in West Virginia.
She loves Uncle Ray and Aunt June. If she made it out, that's exactly where she will be.
He dug out the protein bar, swallowed another gulp of water, and filled the canteen with lake water, using the carbon filter. The filter wouldn't really help make it taste good, but he'd avoid getting parasites and would stay hydrated. After all, he had a hell of a hike in front of him. Jacob hefted the pack onto his back. He had maybe 20 meals, 25 if he stretched it. That could get him pretty far along before he needed to look for more, and he had his gun, so he could hunt in a pinch. He pointed himself toward the east and began walking, slapping at the mosquitoes that were beginning to gather in the cool, shaded areas. He tried to calculate it. West Virginia was over 800 miles away. If he maintained an average of 3 miles per hour and walked at least 6 hours each day, it would take at least 45 days to reach his destination.
I could have stolen a Hummer and been there in a couple of days of driving.
He shook his head and kept walking. Hell, if he'd stolen a vehicle, they would have tracked him down and locked his ass up in the brig. That is, if he was lucky and didn't get shot on sight for desertion. At least this way, he had a chance that they'd just give up. He wasn't the first to desert, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. Nancy. The trailer park was quiet. The fall morning air was crisp, just a hint of what was to come in another month, perhaps 2. The garden was full of fall crops, kale and spinach, along with a bumper crop of carrots. Nancy had helped Harvey cannibalize several of the older trailers for their windows, and they had built several cold frames that would allow them to continue to produce through the winter. The park was far away from main roads, and she was thankful they were isolated. Elkins had been hit hard, first by the Allied South duking it out with the Central Unionists. Then some damned neo-Nazi group had come through in a series of deadly raids, scooping up drugs from the pharmacy inside of Davis Medical Center, and kidnapped a Somali widow and her 2 children. Anyone who stood in their way was shot with terrifying efficiency. Fearing another raid, Nancy and Harvey had downed a large tree across the cracked and winding mountain road that led to Happy Hollow Trailer Park and dug out the battered sign that advertised its presence. 2 families, both from Elkins, had picked their way down the road over the fallen tree and brought a large dog kennel full of chickens with them. Later, a pregnant goat, loose in the woods, had been rounded up and given birth to a kid. With luck, they would find another, and have some breeding stock that could add meat to their diet. With extra hands on board, the garden had tripled in size, the earth surprisingly rich as it yielded forth bountiful harvests over the long summer. With hard work and no small amount of luck, Nancy was reasonably sure they would make it through the winter. Nancy had climbed the radio tower twice before, and she climbed it a 3rd time, braving the winds that tore at her and stared out at the mountains, curving roads, and ruins of Elkins in the distance. Here and there she could see campfires that rose up and blended with the fog that often crept over the mountains and married the treetops to the sky. Their corner of the world was quiet for now. "Jacob, if you are out there, you need to come back to me." Her words were snatched away by the wind, and her eyes hurt as much as her heart did. "I'm sorry I didn't try harder, but I know now how much I need you. Not just JJ, but me too. Come back to us." She clung to the tower, half sitting, half standing, her legs and arms firmly wrapped around the rungs. The cold was creeping into her fingers through her gloves, though, and it was time to go back down. Nancy took one more look at the road that led to the trailer park, a speck of movement catching her eye. A deer, perhaps? They had bagged one over a month ago, and nothing since. What I wouldn't do for venison. The tree cover was too dense. She thought she saw something, but what it was, she couldn't be sure. Jacob. The thin mountain air held a chill. It had since he approached the edge of the Monongahela National Forest 2 days ago, skirting his way around a settled area and heading toward Elkins.
Day 62. Damn, but it's taken a lot to get here.
His boots, designed for war, for marching, along with his fatigues, were still in decent shape, though his clothes were stiff from dirt, and he wondered if any amount of cleaning would remove the stench of 2 months of living out of them. Everything hung loose on him. He had seen his reflection in a glass window, one of the few intact ones in the town of Elkins, and had been shocked at how gaunt he was. He had walked through the town, unnerved by the silence. Several times he was sure he had seen a curtain twitch as he moved past some of the more intact buildings, but no one had ventured forth. This had become routine as he walked the highways and streets. His uniform marked him as a soldier, but no telling which faction, and most of the countryside had seemed to have had their fill of soldiers. They didn't venture out, but he hedged his bets by not approaching either. He had walked too damn far to get shot now. The last week had been the hardest. The miles had been eaten up quickly the first 2 or 3 weeks of his journey, especially once he had made it to Interstate 70, which was, barring bridge collapses and warring factions, still a nearly straight shot to the beautiful mountains and the outer edges of the Monongahela National Forest. He had been born there in Elkins and lived the first 18 years of his life in one shitty foster home after another. The only bright memory was of Nancy and a couple of other high school friends. Nate had made it out and had been in California last he heard. His foster brother, Joe, had ended up serving time for burglary in Tygart Valley Regional, and Perry had been studying to be a mortician like his dad. And of course, Jacob had ended up marrying Nancy. It had been a no-brainer to get hitched when she realized she was pregnant. He had loved her, still did.
If I'd been better at those little things, the little gestures, maybe we would still be together.
Instead, he had focused on his role in the army, moving them from town to town until she had had enough. I'm always having to leave my friends behind, Jacob. I can't go to college. JJ won't make friendships that will last more than a few months, and it's just too damn hard to live like this. He had brushed her concerns off, ignored them, until the papers were served and she had taken JJ and moved to Austin. He didn't blame her. Not one bit. He had been the one to take her for granted, to not listen, and here they were. He was getting close, and if they were here, and he wanted to believe they were, how would she feel about him showing up? Would she welcome him back into her life again, or would he just be an unwelcome reminder of the past? He stumbled, tripped on an uneven portion of pavement, and nearly fell. He was tired, bone-tired each and every day, not enough food, lips dry and cracked, dehydrated since losing the water filter last week crossing a ravine to avoid troop movements. His feet guided him to the lonely, tree-lined road that led to the trailer park. Just a few miles now. He looked up and saw a small flash of sunlight, some lookout up in a tower, and slipped to one side of the road where the trees covered him. What was he walking into? He had stopped at a farm a few days back, helped the old man with the harvest in exchange for food, and gotten an earful about a group of extremists in the area making trouble.
You see anyone moving in a pack bigger than 2, and do what I do. Hide,
the old man had said, waggling a bony spotted finger in his direction.
Those damn neo-Nazis been rounding up women and kidnapping any of them ethnics that they can find. I hear they use them as slaves. Goddamn slaves!
He had spat on the ground then, shook his head.
As if we didn't learn nothing the first time round.
He had offered Jacob a permanent place to stay, shaking his head when the younger man refused.
The offer stands. It's dangerous out there, son. So find what you gotta find, and come back if you can. You and yours would be welcome.
Jacob saw the tree straddling the road in the distance. The sign he had seen 1,000 times, battered yet legible, was missing. He moved off of the road, stepping quietly now. The world, even one he knew like the back of his hand, had changed. Who knew what was waiting for him up ahead? He slid the rifle off his back and double-checked it. There was a round in the chamber. The safety was off, and he crouched slightly, bending his knees and choosing his steps carefully, taking his time. He swung around, moving higher up the north incline, moving carefully as he circled around to the side of the trailer park. They wouldn't be expecting him to come in on the opposite side from where the road led in. The sounds of children playing, laughing, were the first signs that someone still remained. As the trees thinned, he could see an extensive garden located in the sunny central patch next to what had been the trailer park office. Many of the trailers were missing, but the ones that remained were a mix of obviously occupied, as well as others with gaping holes where the windows had been. 100 yards from the garden was a rough corral that held a couple of goats. Chickens strutted about, loose, pecking at the grass and winding their way through the cold frames on the ground. A burst of laughter, and several children came into view. Jacob blinked, barely able to believe his eyes. A tow-headed boy was being chased by 2 smaller children, a boy and a girl, all of them screaming and laughing as they tore around the garden, chickens scattering in their path. Jacob stepped out from the last cover of trees, and the boy looked up, stopping in his tracks so suddenly that the other 2 slammed into him, collapsing on the ground in surprise. The little boy looked up at him and grinned and hurled himself into Jacob's arms.
Daddy!
Jacob hugged his son to his chest and sucked in a breath. Hey, JJ. After all these months of not knowing, hoping against hope, he had found him. He opened his eyes and saw Nancy running towards them. Jacob? Oh my God! Jacob! The strength of her embrace took his breath away, and his fears dissolved as her lips found his. His son was alive. Nancy, his first kiss, his first love, was here in his arms. And after far too long away, after miles of endless road and plenty of hungry days, Jacob knew one thing. He was finally and incontrovertibly home.